The combat in this game is freaking sick. It's true you can make builds that trivialize most of the game, even up until post-game content, but if you really want to learn what this game has in store for you, there's a lot to dig into, both for your own abilities and for enemies and bosses. It's incredibly satisfying to take on some of the game's challenges with the intent to be challenged. Personally, I think it's kind of a shame that the game in its current state allows for some really powerful builds that don't require you to learn enemy movesets or behaviors. It really does a disservice to the combat design, I think. I get that there are people that aren't into playing games purely for the challenge, though. If you like the catharsis of absolutely wrecking everything in your way that used to kill you, there is potential for you to find that here. Personally, I'd rather play a Warriors game or something like that for that kind of thing, because, as I said, it sort of feels like a waste in this game with its more complex combat and movement systems. But hey, everyone plays games for their own reasons, right? Some of my favorite moments thus far have been fighting some of the DLC bosses on New Game Plus or Plus Plus, well above my current character and equipment level. The speed of most of the tougher enemies and bosses in this game really gets you into this adrenaline-fueled zone where every split second your life hangs in the balance, and overcoming the battle is just an incredible feeling. Although this game gets compared a lot to other games and certainly wears its Souls influences on its sleeve, I think, in practice the actual systems are miles apart. The speed is reminiscent of Ninja Gaiden, actually, especially on the later New Game Pluses. Which brings me to one of my major complaints. So, the base game has its new game, this difficulty is called Way of the Samurai, and one New Game Plus cycle called Way of the Strong. What's nice is that when you complete the game, it just goes right back in and you can pick to play on a newly unlocked difficulty in the same main map that you just beat the game on. So you can always go back if you miss something, and switching between difficulties is easy. All good stuff. The problem is that all of Way of the Samurai, especially if you do all sub-missions, has you leveling up at a pace that makes most of the game not very challenging. You can't even really experience the true depth of the combat or the intense visceral experiences the game can offer yet, because it doesn't push you to those things. Way of the Strong does help a bit since everything gets stronger, but outside of that, almost nothing changes. It's just stat numbers going up. It's really a shame because your entire first two runs will be only moderately interesting. There will be many areas and levels that feel weirdly empty. If the alpha and beta were anything to go by, it's probably because they were originally designed to accommodate much larger enemy numbers. This all changes when you get to New Game Plus Plus, Way of the Demon. This mode ramps up a bit more than the last, adding enemies to some areas and adding new red aura enemies that are greatly buffed mobs to appear occasionally. Doing some of the levels in Demon with the character just a bit under-leveled has held some really great experiences for me so far. One particular version of a DLC boss, a duel with a sort of centipede man, was an incredible battle for me, and finally beating him felt amazing. This mode also finally brings changes to co-op, adding a few more enemies in some areas and giving most of the bosses adds that show up at certain health breakpoints. This is a godsend, as co-op until this mode has been brain-dead easy on bosses, and this change means that at the very least you do have to do some crowd control. Granted, in co-op most of the bosses are still not that hard, even with adds, just because having two people exponentially increases your combat ability. Still, better than it has been until now. The exceptions to this mostly being in the DLC bosses, of which some of them have adds that aren't just basic enemies, but some of the stronger, more dangerous variants that you can't kill in just a few combos. That stuff gets crazy hard. So now, with the second DLC, we have the new Way of the Wise. This is what I wanted, Team Ninja! This is the true Neo. Enemies from both DLCs now populate the game from the beginning. Those red aura enemies are buffed even more, and some of them can now cancel your buffs if they get a clean hit on you. A bunch of enemies have completely new attacks. Enemies are organized in more devious ways. Alarm enemies that alert a whole area to your presence are a bit more numerous. Enemies that can detect you when using invisibility skills are around. Even bosses have new attacks. Every single encounter has the potential to be fatal, and you constantly feel pushed to use all of your tools. It's awesome. And yet, there's a hang-up here too. First, both Way of the Demon and of the Wise are only available if you've purchased a DLC. It's not that I'm not happy with the value, because I definitely am. It's just a shame that the best, most challenging modes aren't available without the DLC. Still, those DLCs aren't just difficulties. They add new areas with new story and submissions, a new weapon type each, new enemies, and other good stuff like Way of the Wise completely redoing the enemy positions and numbers. Then there's the fact that in order to experience the extra difficulties, you have to have already beaten the game twice through with the same character. I imagine that for most people, even the ones already interested in the potential challenge, might have already stopped playing simply because it felt like the game was getting boring. Putting you through nearly the same content twice is definitely going to wear in some people, and the best, most well thought out content isn't even until the later modes. I really wish there was a way to start on the later difficulties but simply have them scaled down to your level so you could at least experience the level design in a way that was probably closer to the original intent earlier on. So, to talk about co-op a bit more, as I briefly mentioned, for both Way of the Samurai and Strong, there are no major changes, so it really just becomes easy mode. Demon and Wise help with that though, and it really changes the way the game feels. There can be so many enemies at times that the pace of battle gets incredibly frantic, and it feels amazing. There's lots of chances for clutch moments, saves, and great teamwork, so long as both players are actually being aware of such things. If you can find someone like that, it becomes an amazing experience. The game has two ways to co-op. One is almost exactly the same as Souls style. You invite someone into your instance of the game to help you progress, and they get rewards for helping. Completion ultimately depends on you surviving to the end. The other way is that you both enter the same instance of a world, so completion needs both of you to survive. Unfortunately, when the game first came out, this latter type was only possible if both players had finished a selected level, meaning you couldn't actually progress the game together. Team Ninja said they did this because being able to co-op missions you hadn't completed would make the game too easy, but I think they should have just added some more enemies in co-op at least then. And in the end, as of a recent patch, they actually changed it so that you could co-op missions you haven't completed, so they just completely reverted to how it was in the alpha and beta. Probably too little too late for some consumers, unfortunately, but at least it's there now. If you have a friend you can play with, I definitely recommend doing some co-op on those later difficulties. It is incredibly fun. I've had multiple instances of last-second saves just before a game over, and the pure chaos that can happen in the higher difficulties is really conducive to that kind of experience. To expand on the topic of builds just a bit, this is yet another area that I have mixed feelings on. On the one hand, there's a really wide variety of builds possible, whether being light and quick, heavy and slow, a mix of those, focusing on magic, focusing on status elements, long-range builds, etc., etc. The issue is that the balance of builds is heavily skewed in favor of one or two builds who focus on making one ability incredibly powerful. It can be a bummer to summon someone like that when you want to co-op, and they can just trivialize everything without a sweat. I mean, that's how I feel about it at least, but then, depending on how you look at it, you could say that it's awesome that you can break the game that much. It just depends on what you're looking for going into the game, since it can provide a challenge, but its loot system makes it also possible to trivialize the challenge if you're willing to grind time instead of grinding knowledge of the combat. I kind of wish they had made more of a straight action game or more of an action RPG game. It's so smack dab in the center that I feel like neither side is probably completely satisfied, but that's not to say that it can't appeal to anyone. I play in spite of this using builds I simply find fun to play, but I'm sure many people play because you can make such strong builds when you look at how many topics and videos there are about builds. So, on to level design. The level design, again, is a mixed bag. It actually has a surprising amount of variation in the ways levels progress or what gimmicks they might have, but I really think the light enemy count and basic enemy placement don't help how the levels feel. As I mentioned, there are many areas that feel needlessly large relative to the enemy count, and there are areas that have actually needless shortcuts. I feel like it's a huge shame the game doesn't have an invasion system like Dark Souls, because invasions would actually require much more knowledge of the maps, and all those ways to cut back and loop around would have more purpose. Another issue is that almost all the levels are lines. Curvy, loopy lines, yes, but there is no exploration aspect in most of them early on. It just makes for somewhat boring level progression, and definitely doesn't do that great of a job hooking a new player. Thankfully, they do get quite a bit more interesting in the latter half of the game, though. Still, one of the less obvious, but in ways probably worse parts, is that many areas feel too gamey, actually. Like, you'll be in an underground cave, and the floor is just perfectly even, whereas the walls will be rocky and craggy, looking like an actual cave. But it just ends up looking like a cheap stage play because of that floor sometimes. It makes sense for castles and man-made structures, of course, but it just doesn't feel natural in other areas, and it makes it kind of boring to look at. There's not really any cool vistas, and only a few levels actually really look cool and are memorable outside of boss fights or specific enemy encounters. The story and plot is incredibly straightforward, and it moves at a strange pace, having just occasional cutscenes and mostly progressing from setting to setting with text. It's not a big problem, but it is pretty unsatisfying and that they can't at least show some growth of the main character, William. You start in England, and in the next mission you're in Japan, and he just knows how to use the weapons there and a bunch of other stuff just from reading some books. I do like all the character designs quite a lot, though. They're some of the best renditions of these historical figures I've seen in the game, both stylish and refined, not too realistic, and not too fantasy for the most part, but just tons of character. It's good stuff. So, there's probably a lot more I could talk about, but suffice to say, I really love this game a lot, at times. It just feels like every time I have something great to say about it, there's some aspect of it that disappoints. I'd still recommend the game to anyone that loves action games, but with the caveat that they need to understand the best content is locked way, way deep in the game. If they can persevere, though, they'll be rewarded with a worthwhile challenge. This has been Gosaraki, and thanks for checking out this video. See you guys next time.